All right, hello everyone. Just want to do a quick sound check right quick. If you're able to hear me, can you tell me the weather conditions in your area? Whether it's sunny, rainy, cloudy, or something other. Okay, great. All right, great. I see some responses coming in, so that means you can hear me. If anyone has issues with audio during the call, please feel free to dial into the conference bridge. That information is posted in the message window. You have to say this call is being recorded, so if there's any reason that you do not want to be recorded, please feel free to drop now. The recording will be posted in our Yammer community in the next couple of days or so. The presentation is actually available now, and the Yammer community, the link is posted in the message window as well. So welcome to the Azure Infrastructure Partner Community Call for April. I'm excited about the topic that we have this month, the much anticipated solution offering Azure Stack. We're going to get a great overview by Bradley Bartz. And at this time, I'll turn things over to him.
All right. Well, welcome everyone. Glad to have you here this morning. And we're going to talk about Azure Stack. And I'm a program manager working on the Azure Stack engineering team. So we're the team building and assembling and shipping Azure Stack. So we're going to go through what it is and why we're doing it this morning as we go through this. Hopefully everyone is aware that Microsoft's cloud strategy is about a global, trusted, and hybrid cloud offering to have the largest reach for our customers and partners in our ecosystem across the globe. And so we'll go through what that means and how we're delivering that. A big part of our hybrid strategy is Azure Stack. And the best way to think about Azure Stack is, what is it? Why are we doing it? Azure Stack, the best context is that Azure Stack is an extension of Azure. Now, this is distinctly different from how we've positioned other private cloud strategies where there's a private cloud strategy or software-defined data center. Azure Stack is not part of that motion. Azure Stack really is an Azure instance. It's an Azure computing platform that can be deployed and operated on-premise inside the firewall by both service providers and enterprises alike for running Azure workloads. And it's an extension of our hybrid cloud strategy with Azure. Okay, and what does this do? Why do we provide this Azure consistent platform? It's not just an Azure consistent platform, it is Azure. And I need to really stress that. And because it is Azure, we gain from that this consistency. What do we mean by that? What we mean is, and this is one of the things I think Jeffrey Snover coined the term, that cloud is a model, not a place. What we mean by that is that the way you describe, the way you manage, deploy, the lifecycle, the types of resources that you can provision, how you think about the lifecycle of those resources, how those resources are accounted for from both a usage standpoint as well as providing RBAC and control. All of those concepts are part of our cloud model, specifically the Azure cloud model, the Microsoft Azure cloud model. This is a model that both infrastructure, for infrastructure as code, it is a model for doing modern application development, for doing cloud elastic applications. This model is our cloud model. And we say it's a model, not a place. What we mean by that is the ability to take that model and use that model in a variety of places, whether it happens to be in a Microsoft operated data center, service provider operated data center, or within an organization in an IT operated data center. The model is the same. So that's what we mean by a truly consistent hybrid platform, is that you have this continuity of the model regardless of the location where the cloud is running. Okay, so we're going to take a peek real quickly on how we've realized that. So this is a very high-level, simplified view of our Azure platform in the public cloud today. And that is, there's a cloud infrastructure. This is our geo-scalable cloud platform that is stretching across the globe today. On top of that, we start to layer a set of services. These are services that provide IaaS, which is really about our infrastructure as code capabilities for how we provision infrastructure, as well as the PaaS services that run on top of that infrastructure, along with a control plane. That control plane is the Azure Resource Manager. The Azure Resource Manager is how you access any of the resources that are running in the cloud and provide the set of controls across those resources, and then a variety of ways to access the control plane, whether you happen to be using our portal experience in Azure when you go to portal.azure.com, whether you're looking at using PowerShell, the CLI on Linux or Mac operating systems, and whether you're using DevOps tools or CI/CD platforms, whether you're using Visual Studio or Eclipse. All of these tools access the Azure control plane, which is a REST-based interface over the Azure Resource Manager to access the set of IaaS and PaaS services running on top of our cloud infrastructure. So this is a very simplified view of our Azure platform, but this is Azure. Now when we look at Azure Stack, it is an instance of that platform, of all those layers. So you'll notice I'm going to go from the top down this time. As we start looking at the portal, the PowerShell, the DevOps tools, those tools are not specialized for Azure Stack. They are the same tools that you use for Azure. They also work with Azure Stack. Okay, and we've done that so that we don't have to have an Azure Stack version of Visual Studio. We don't have to have Azure Stack versions of PowerShell, CLI, or open source tools. The same tools work with Azure and Azure Stack. That is made possible because we have the Azure Resource Manager as part of the Azure Stack platform. So the same control plane that we offer in Azure is also included in Azure Stack. Underneath that control plane are the set of services, these services that are exposing capabilities through the control plane. This is our IaaS for infrastructure as code, as well as our PaaS platforms. And those, just to be more specific, our IaaS platform is actually composed of a minimum of 3 resource providers or resource types: compute, storage, and networking. And for many of us in the infrastructure space, these are concepts we've been used to for a long time. What's different in Azure is these are actually very specific versioned contracts for a REST interface. There's Microsoft.compute, then there's virtual machines, there's disks, there's a bunch of different constructs or VM scale sets, constructs that are part of that namespace with a set of capabilities and properties can be set. The same is true for networking and storage. So these are very specific service constructs that are enable the infrastructure as code model on our IaaS layer, as well as app services, function, service fabric, and container services are coming. But you get this rich set of services that are being exposed, both from an infrastructure and PaaS layer through the Azure Resource Manager. The same services that we're offering in Azure. The same capabilities for those services. Now we're starting to get a little bit more differentiation from what we have in Azure. Azure has a global infrastructure, an infrastructure that's designed for geo-scale across the globe. Azure Stack is designed for a self-managed, a much smaller footprint that can be run independently inside an organization. So now we have what we refer to as a cloud infrastructure. It's an integrated system, and it's cloud inspired. We have taken the learnings and the experience we've gotten from Azure. We've been able to specialize that to run in a much smaller form factor, and we're delivering this as an integrated system. Okay, if this is the first time you're hearing this, I want this to kind of resonate. Azure Stack is not a software-only solution. Azure Stack is an integrated system. It is an Azure device, an Azure appliance that is deployed. It's a cloud operating platform, hardware and software, that is delivered and running and provides that integrated system, delivering that Azure functionality on premises. By providing these layers and abstractions in the same way that Azure has, using the same code as Azure, we provide a truly consistent environment where I can use the same tools, the same DevOps processes, the same automation that I would use for Azure. I can extend that inside the data center, inside the firewall. So here you're seeing that consistency between developers and IT to use the same thing. And this is why the best way to think of Azure Stack as an extension of Azure, where you're able to take the patterns and practices that have been developed for the cloud and now apply those inside the data center. Matter of fact, the best use cases, and we'll get into this for Azure Stack, are actually Azure use cases. Let's go ahead and look at that right now. The use cases for Azure Stack are into three broad categories. One I'll call edge processing and analytics. What do we mean by that? This is for applications typically in the IoT space, factory floor, scenarios where you have a set of functionality that you're running in Azure, but I need to extend the computational power of that solution to the edge, or basically outside of the Microsoft data center for more localized computation, where I may need to have the logic running closer to the actual devices. And that's for edge processing and analytics. And we have several use cases that are kind of falling into that category. Another pattern that we see developing is what I'm going to call the cloud application model, but on-premise. And this is kind of an interesting, these are for solutions where customers are building a portfolio of applications. They have a large assets, and so they're starting to modernize part of their applications that are deployed and operating in Azure. But they also have another portion of their portfolio that needs to stay inside the data center, whether that be for data sovereignty or latency or regulatory concerns where it's just needs, or geopolitical concerns. It needs to be located in a different boundary, if you will. But you don't want to have to take a whole new development process, a whole new skill set, a whole new methodology for building those applications in your portfolio. Because a big part of that consistency is be able to have that continuity of people, processes, and artifacts, so that I can use the same people, the same processes, and have the same artifacts, regardless of whether I'm deploying them in the public space or within the sovereign space of my organization. And so this is the idea that I can apply those same application patterns to applications that are running on the local cloud in my data center. And finally, the third use case is the same application deployed to any location. What is this all about? We have customers right now in Azure that have built very successful businesses. They're operating in Azure, and they have either a SaaS or a PaaS offering. They have global reach, and now, because of the success of their solution, the applications that they've developed in Azure are attracting customers that are in geographies where Azure is not. And so these customers are looking for ways to bring their solutions to those customers, to accelerate their growth of their business beyond the boundaries of Azure today. Azure Stack gives them the ability to deploy their solution into these other geographies, where they can, with Azure Stack, have Azure Stack deployed into South America, into the Africa region, and into other geographies where Azure doesn't have a presence today. Get their solution there and start serving those customers in that geography. So these are the three primary use cases, and there's all kinds of permutations within these broad categories. But this is where we see most of the energy being invested in Azure Stack today, is in these three broad categories. So what is the Azure Stack promise? Promise number one is that consistent application development, this consistent model, this continuity. It really is an Azure instance for self-operated environments that provides that continuity. Promise number two, part of that is the delivery of Azure services, and make them available on-premise. Now, that doesn't mean all Azure services will be available on-premise. What it means is that we're creating an environment where Azure services will have the ability to be deployed or provide presence or capabilities on premise. A great example is in TP3 today. When you get our TP3 refresh, we actually have app services, which is part of that, which is our web apps, our API apps, our mobile apps are all part of that. And new in TP3, which is our technical preview 3 of Azure Stack, which is readily available. You can download it and start playing with it now. That solution includes a new service for the very first time on Azure Stack, which is Azure Functions, for doing serverless computing, kind of the application model that Azure Functions brings to the platform, which is available in Azure today. A runaway success is now also available in Azure Stack. So this ability to now host and deliver these Azure services. Finally, the third promise is that it's a purpose-built integrated system. And what this really means is quicker time to market, less hassle, more reliability, predictability, more a seamless servicing, upgrade, and support model for the entire solution that we're bringing. So you get this basically a turnkey Azure instance ready to go as an integrated system. These are the three promises that Azure Stack is bringing. So with those three things, this is just a recap now of what you're getting. And this is this consistent application development environment that I can basically describe, deploy, and control my applications, whether I'm deploying them in Azure or in Azure Stack. I can have the same DevOps, the same CI/CD platform. I can have the same catalog of artifacts that I'm deploying. There's a great demo that we have queued up, and as you'll be able to see here soon online, if it's not already on Channel 9, which is actually showing Visual Studio Online as a development platform doing CI/CD. So here you are using Azure to build your application, and as part of that build verification, so the scenario that we have demonstrated in Azure is the building of the application, and in this case, interestingly enough, many customers, even though the intent is to build and deploy an application that will run solely inside the firewall, are using Azure for their dev test environment because they're using the elastic capacity when dev teams need to scale up and do a lot of load testing and testing their application. And then when they actually deploy into production, they'll deploy that on premises. So using Azure as kind of this elastic dev platform while they vet and validate their platform. So what we show in this sample is using Visual Studio Online to do the development and the build process, the check-ins. When you submit a check-in, it automatically goes into a build. The build process runs. Once the build is complete, it goes through a set of validation tests in Azure. Once the validation tests are complete, it automatically deploys to an Azure Stack instance on-premise behind the firewall for staging and final verification before going into production. So here you can see this continuity of development environment where with one set of artifacts, one set of skill set, I'm able to have this continuous pipeline across the clouds, across our public cloud into the on-premises environment. What makes that possible is this consistent platform that you're seeing, this ability to describe, deploy, and control holistically. And by the way, when we say control, one of the capabilities that a lot of people are not aware of is that in addition to being able to describe an application, deploy it through the Azure Resource Manager, the Azure Resource Manager also provides RBAC, the ability to set access control points on portions of an application. On the resource group, you can define who gets access to this resource group and what accesses they have. In addition to that, you can also assign policy to your resource group in addition to RBAC controls. So there's a lot of control capabilities built into the Azure Resource Manager. All of this basically allows you to now have that cloud model independent of location. Whether you're talking about experience, operations, deployment, automation, application patterns, tooling, it is one cohesive ecosystem and experience independent of deployment location. This allows us to have this one Azure ecosystem so that our, and what I want to mention there, we have a very large and growing Azure ecosystem today of a lot of technologies, both first-party, third-party, and open-source technologies that are designed for the Azure cloud model, that are updated. Even though we're talking about Docker, Red Hat, these are deployments of those solutions that know how to deploy on Azure, that know how to provision themselves in resource groups on the control plane, know how to deploy and provision that infrastructure as code on demand to support their platform. Those solutions work equally well on Azure Stack as they do on Azure. And because of that, one of the new capabilities we're enabling in Azure Stack, and it's available right now with TP3, so when you get our latest technical preview 3 and download it, there's a feature we have for Azure Marketplace syndication. Now, what syndication allows you to do is go through and look at a curated list of Azure Marketplace items that are available, that have been verified, and are ready for deployment, not only in Azure, but can be syndicated down into Azure Stack for deployment on Azure Stack. Now remember, Azure Stack is like this self-contained Azure instance, this ability to have this isolated compute or connected compute platform for running Azure workloads. So as part of that platform, it includes its own mini marketplace that the IT or service provider gets to curate the marketplace for what is deployable in that Azure Stack instance. So it needs to have its own little marketplace or catalog populated. Now a catalog can be populated just independently by an operator. I can author my own marketplace items and templates that I want to make broadly available to my users. But in addition to that, I have the ability to suck down marketplace items from the Azure public marketplace for redistribution in my own Azure Stack instance. We refer to this capability as marketplace syndication, which allows these solutions to work on Azure Stack without modification. And that's what we mean by a one Azure ecosystem. By the way, and when you look in the Azure Marketplace syndication that's available for TP3 today, you'll even see some third-party solutions, open source solutions, as well as first-party. For example, Kemp, a builder of a network virtual appliance, has a solution in Azure that is also making their solution available to Azure Stack. So this allows our Azure ecosystem, our ISV partners, to get the broadest reach possible. They can develop solutions that not only run on Azure, but now can stretch their solutions, make those available to the edge of Azure, wherever somebody can deploy and operate Azure Stack. So it's really growing that ecosystem. And again, this is touching on a scenario I described earlier about having a common DevOps lifecycle across Azure and Azure Stack. This unified deployment experience with Visual Studio, with VSO Online. You can use Jenkins. And matter of fact, even that scenario I described with VSO Online, that also works with Visual Studio Team Systems when you're running on-premise. Let me touch on just that for a quick moment. Azure Stack, because it is this self-operated Azure instance, has some capabilities that you don't necessarily find in Azure from an operator standpoint, and that is really tied to its configuration and deployment. Azure Stack does support what we refer to in general terms as a connected or disconnected model. So in the connected model, it's really an extension of the hybrid cloud where you're using Azure and Azure Stack. They're operating consistently. You can have single sign-on between Azure and Azure Stack, and you can do this by federating identities with Azure Active Directory, so you can use the same Azure Active Directory tenants that you're using for your organization. You can onboard those tenants to Azure Stack. One of the new capabilities in our TP3 refresh that just went out is what we refer to as multi-tenancy, but it is the ability to onboard multiple AAD directory tenants onto a single Azure Stack stamp. And this is especially crucial for our service provider community, but even for organizations. I was working with an organization just the other day who has 3 AAD tenants. Now, this is a single organization, but they have 3 AAD tenants in Azure. They have a development tenant where all their developers live. They have a test and a QA for acceptance testing directory tenants. And they've decided organizationally create these 3 boundaries for how they've organized their workflows, their isolation envelopes, if you will, for sharing and interoperability. And this is very nice because one of the things that happen when you create these different AAD tenants, that defines your RBAC boundaries. So when you go and assign role-based access, the number of participants that can participate in that role-based access is scoped to a directory tenant. Because Azure Stack now supports multiple AAD tenants on a single Azure Stack stamp, that allows that organization now to use those same organization. Remember, people, process, and artifacts, they can use the same people and processes that they're using for Azure. They can use those now with Azure Stack. It's also important to our service provider community so they can onboard multiple organizations which have multiple directory tenants. Key capability that's coming in. And at the end of the day, it's providing this common workflow automation tooling process between Azure and Azure Stack. Okay. A big part of what Azure Stack is doing is now bringing this this services available, this continuity. Azure is more than an IaaS. It is not a virtualization platform. It has virtualization capabilities through its IaaS or infrastructure as code kind of platform and capabilities, but it is more than that. It's a set of PaaS and SaaS offerings. So when we look at Azure Stack, it really is that computational framework of services that are required for building modern applications. It certainly does include the infrastructure or IaaS set of services, compute, storage, and networking. I'm now going to name a couple of others that come into that space. For example, Key Vault. Key Vault is absolutely critical, even in the IaaS space. What Key Vault is a way of managing secrets in a cloud environment so that we can stop passing passwords and credentials around in our scripts, in our templates. There's nothing worse than checking in a password into source code control so something can be deployed and automated. Because now everybody with access to that is getting access to those passwords, and now we create a leaky environment. The way we manage that in Azure is with Key Vaults. It's a way to securely manage secrets, and then what gets checked in as part of the template is basically the Key Vault artifact that it will be drawing the password from, so passwords can be rotated without changing your automation, without updating your scripts. You can update Key Vault when things are provisioned. They'll automatically use the latest passwords and things that have been set for those applications. This idea of using Key Vault. So Key Vault is part of our platform in Azure Stack, so you can manage secrets holistically between the public cloud and the self-hosted environments in Azure Stack. Even for our IaaS, I mentioned briefly compute, storage, and networking. Well, our storage capabilities, while it is true storage also provides disks and temp disk capabilities that are used as part of the virtualization capabilities, our storage service also provides blobs, tables, and queues that are used for application development. That is part of our storage layer. Another thing our infrastructure layer in Azure has been reimagined in the last several years to basically be now a PaaS platform for doing modern PaaS applications. And so some constructs have shown up in our compute layer, such as virtual VM extensions, such as VM scale sets. These are important constructs that are used by modern PaaS layers that run on top of IaaS. For example, Service Fabric, Cloud Foundry, Mesos. All these technologies now can layer on top of our infrastructure as code using VM extensions and VM scale sets as a way to basically manage that infrastructure underneath their PaaS platform. So this is IaaS that has been reimagined as a PaaS accelerator. And so this is what's happening in Azure today. So that's what you're starting to see in Azure Stack as well, this modern IaaS platform as a PaaS accelerator. So then we're seeing things like app services being able to land on Azure Stack, Azure Functions coming on board for this consistency, allowing our app developers to take advantage of more and more Azure capabilities as part of building their application portfolio. Two new services that are in the backlog I can talk about. They're coming. But they're not in the builds today, and they won't be available at GA, but they're coming very shortly after GA. But I can talk about those two services are our Azure Container Service and our Service Fabric as a Service capabilities. Interestingly enough, this is worth mentioning. Many of these technologies, in this case both ACS, or Azure Container Service, and Service Fabric, can be used as a dedicated technology for a given application without having to use them as a service. So for example, I'll use Redis Cache. Right now you can go into the Azure Marketplace and you can deploy a Redis cache for use by your application. And it's running on infrastructure that is owned by the application layer, because they're deploying the VM, its infrastructure is closed with Redis cache in it, and then used by their application. So that you can use Redis cache. You can do that today in Azure, and you can do that model in Azure Stack as well. Then there's what we call the Redis cache as a service, where you can basically request a Redis cache through a REST API. You get those capabilities, but you're not seeing the VMs provisioned as part of that Redis cache capability for your application. That's this other multi-tenanted version of Redis cache that we have in Azure, and that's an example of the multi-tenanted version that is not yet available in Azure Stack. That is true also for the Azure Container Service and for Service Fabric. Now you can still deploy, there's a technology called the Azure Container Service Engine. It's an open source engine that allows you to generate the templates that are used by Redis, that are used for the Azure Container Service. Those templates will work in Azure Stack or Azure. So you can use the Azure Container Service Engine and generate templates for deployment in both, but you don't have the multi-tenanted service yet. The good news is they're coming. So I just wanted to tee those up as two additional services that are in our backlog that will be coming soon. And here you'll see those. So as we go through the list, here's what's coming in our backlog for Azure Stack. We have Azure App Services, which is our web apps, mobile apps, API apps. Azure Functions is part of our serverless computing technologies. Our Azure Service Fabric as a multi-tenanted service is coming. Azure Container Service is a multi-tenanted service. They're also available as an IaaS based deployment immediately, or as a multi-tenanted service down the road, ultimately enabling other PaaS platforms like Cloud Foundry. Okay. All of those services build on top of kind of our foundation of virtual machines, VM scale sets, containers with Docker and across Linux and Windows. That container strategy is now, by the way, ACS works on Linux and Windows. It's how we help manage containers, our virtual networking, load balancing, VPN gateways, blob tables, and queues. So a lot of these points I've already touched on, and this just reemphasizes those capabilities. These services will be available at GA. They're available today, actually, in TP3, so you can play with them. This slide is talking to a point that I touched on earlier about those three use cases. If you remember, one was edge processing and analytics, one was about using the cloud model on premises, and the third option, which is being able to have the same application deployed to multiple environments. So here I'm showing where Azure is today. Azure is in 38 regions across the globe. What we're doing with Azure Stack is we're now extending Azure Stack to service providers that can operate an Azure instance in geographies where Azure isn't. And what this is doing is increasing the reach for our ISV ecosystem, for our solutions, our partners, to be able to bring an Azure solution into these geographies. We further extend that with allowing organizations to self-host and operate an Azure instance. And now you can start to see, remember something I touched on earlier about the cloud being a model, not a place. This is what we mean. This is a very nice visual representation of what we mean. This allows that cloud model to now have this kind of reach into all of these environments, all of these geographies that would be otherwise unattainable. But I can use the same people, processes, and artifacts across all of these geographies, across the open source, across the Microsoft, across first-party, third-party solutions. I can take advantage of that cohesive cloud model in any of these geographies and environments. That's why Azure Stack is so critically important. Okay, what's making this possible? And that is the fact that it's a purpose-built system for operational excellence. This is where we're getting into the integrated solution. The integrated solution is about increasing our time to value, how quickly you can get a cloud up and running, I'm sure several people in the attendance today have witnessed cloud initiatives that have spun up and spun out of control and been going on for months or years and then never fully realized their potential, if not being scrapped outright. Cloud is hard. Cloud is complicated. There's a lot of moving pieces, all the way from software at the top and different contracts that need to be maintained for cloud applications, all the way down to firmware, to routers, to switches, to storage, and whether they're compatible, and whether there's an inconsistency somewhere in the bowels of the system that now make it break farther up the stack. So in order to provide a truly cohesive, verified, certified platform that is versioned and updated holistically, we have this integrated system that allows us to have rapid time to value, good lifecycle management, and a continuous wave of innovation that we know we can deliver to our customers as new capabilities are made available in a predictable manner. That's what we're getting with our integrated system strategy. Now, once we go with the integrated systems, the next question that comes up, well, how do you get them? Where do they come from? We have 4 vendors already announced. 3 are in the works today with that'll be available at launch. Our launch partners include Dell EMC, HPE Enterprise, and Lenovo. Cisco has also announced, and I don't have timing on when the Cisco integrated system will be available. These are systems that are using basically off-the-shelf hardware, but in a configuration against a reference architecture that is certified down to which version and the capabilities that are there that are tested and validated with Azure Stack and delivered as an integrated system. So we have these integrated systems from Dell, HPE, Lenovo, and Cisco coming, and this is how you'll get Azure Stack. You'll get Azure Stack as one of these integrated systems. Now, you just saw, or I mentioned earlier, hey, you can go download Azure Stack today. Well, what's that all about? You're not downloading one of these appliances. That would be pretty cool, by the way. No, what's happening is we basically have what we call our Azure Stack POC, or proof of concept. That proof of concept we also refer to and think of as our dev kit. It is an ability to take the Azure Stack software and hydrate it on hardware that you already have for test purposes, for evaluation purposes. It is not capable of running production workloads. It is a one-server deployment. It doesn't have multi-node. It doesn't have elasticity. It doesn't have a lot of capabilities that you would need for production. It doesn't have a patch and update mechanism, but it allows you to do a deployment and an evaluation of the Azure Stack capabilities. But when it's time to do a real deployment for production and building out an environment, this is what you'll be getting, is an Azure Stack integrated system from Dell, Lenovo, HP, or Cisco. Okay. Over time, we'll be adding additional hardware partners. We're working with some now, and as their solutions come together, we'll be able to make announcements. So we're increasing the vendor options that are available for getting Azure Stack over time. Okay, so what is the Azure Stack integrated system lifecycle? Okay, there's an architecture, hardware, and topology as part of the lifecycle, designing the system, and this is where we work with a vendor to get the scale and meet the needs of your organization. There's a deployment, configuration, and provisioning of the stack that is done as part of hydrating that hardware and making it ready for deployment. A validation phase where everything is validated and certified, is ready to go. Then we get into monitoring and diagnostics. There's security and privacy technologies that are built in, business continuity, a patching and updating service, and then field replacement of parts. All of these capabilities are part of the integrated system lifecycle for a continuous flow of innovation from Azure to Azure Stack in conjunction with our hardware partners. So that will kind of beg the question, okay, you've got it, and now you have a question. How do you get support? Because is it a Microsoft solution? Is it a vendor solution from Dell, Lenovo, HP, and Cisco? How do we do this? It is a coordinated effort. You'll be able to pick up and get frontline support from either Microsoft or directly from the OEM. And as part of that engagement, when you call in, we are linking our ticketing and supporting systems so that you'll be able to make one call. And as part of that call, we'll be able to bring in the right knowledge and subject matter experts to help resolve that issue as quickly as possible. So this is a support system specifically for Azure Stack, running at each of our hardware partners as well as within Microsoft. And then we do coordinated escalation and resolution between Microsoft and our hardware partner to ensure that you get the right answer, the right solution as quickly as possible. So it's a consistent support experience no matter who you contact support. Coordinated escalation and resolution. Cloud services support delivered by Microsoft. What we mean by that is if you have a question or problem that you clearly know is related to using perhaps app services or clearly related to Azure functions or it's an Azure technology at the top of the stack, you can start directly with Microsoft, but you could go to your OEM and they'll escalate to Microsoft and it'll get there. But the support services will be delivered by Microsoft, and the actual hardware services will be delivered by our hardware partners, but we'll coordinate and escalate appropriately based on the needs of a given scenario. Okay, let's talk briefly about how Azure Stack scales. All right, when we talk about an Azure environment, what do we really mean? So an Azure environment is basically constituted, it starts with our control plane. What is our control plane? If you go back to those high-level diagrams I described earlier, it is the Azure Resource Manager. That Azure Resource Manager constitutes the control plane of an Azure instance. So when you go to our Azure public cloud and access the manage.azure, you'll get the ARM endpoint for the capabilities that are coming from our public cloud. Now Azure, we also have a federal cloud, part of our sovereign clouds, Azure US Gov. Our Gov cloud has another Azure Resource Manager for that Azure environment. So every Azure environment has its own control plane. And then within that control plane, you can manage the capacity of the cloud that it is controlling. So now we talk about Azure Stack. There is one cloud endpoint. That cloud endpoint is the Azure Resource Manager. Now, the Azure Resource Manager is architected to accommodate multiple regions. This is how we have West US and East US and our different regions in Azure is because Azure Resource Manager allows you to specify location as part of the provisioning and management of the lifecycle of resources. And that same capability is built into Azure Stack to be multi-region aware and support those capabilities. And then with each region, we have what we refer to as scale units, so that you can grow the capacity of a region by adding more scale units to that region. Okay? So this is how we think about capacity and scale. I can scale a region, and I can add additional capacity by adding multiple regions. Now, let's kind of peel the onion for just a minute here and drill into this. The smallest scale unit that Azure Stack supports is 4 servers. So when it comes time to go into production and you call up your hardware provider of choice and you start talking about getting Azure Stack, the smallest unit that you'll be able to acquire Azure Stack is our 4-server scale unit. And that provides the capability. And in that 4-server, basically one-fourth of that, the 1/4 is being used for the management overhead and the 3/4 available for application workloads. As you add additional scale units, that management overhead is not replicated. You're then adding more and more application layer support. So our smallest unit of scale is 4 servers. Now, you can then grow scale by adding additional scale units and then eventually adding more regions. Now, let's talk about how we're rolling out Azure Stack. Azure Stack is scheduled to be generally available this summer. So and we refer to this as GA. Now this is when we make the solution available, and then it'll basically be made available for our hardware partners to then start provisioning and making available on the integrated systems. The scale that will be made available at that time will support one region with one scale unit, and that scale unit can come in 3 configurations: 4, 8, and 12 servers. So this summer, you'll be able to get Azure Stack configured with a single region and a scale unit as 4, 8, or 12. And then over time, you'll be able to incrementally add additional capabilities to that scale unit, to grow that scale unit, and then over time, we'll add the capability to add additional regions. And this is what we refer to here. Post-GA, we have in the backlog coming multi-region support for additional capability and geo-redundancy, along with the ability to add additional scale units within a region for improved infrastructure management. So those are both coming post-GA. So the recommended right now, if you're going to have an early adopter program and get started with Azure Stack this summer, is to anticipate the best size you're going to need for what you're going to do initially with Azure Stack as 4, 8, or 12. Okay. With Azure Stack, we have a patching and update capability, and this is where we're pre-validated updates for software, features, and security, and drivers from Microsoft and partners for delivering a consistent update platform into our from Microsoft to our customers. This is a frequent updates on a known cadence. The customers can choose when to take them. Now, there's a key point here. At no point in time does Microsoft ever reach into and manage or update an Azure Stack directly. Remember, Azure Stack supports both a connected and disconnected, behind the firewall, securely locked down environment. So at no time does Azure Stack ever have to expose an endpoint that can be accessible by a Microsoft engineer, technician, or support. Our patching and update service is a pull model. So what that means is that as part of Azure Stack deployment, it has a service that can actually go up and look into Azure. Are there any updates that I need to pull down and orchestrate in deployment? And so the operator of Azure Stack can decide at what frequency and when to pull down and deploy an update. And you'll know that those updates are certified and approved and been pre-validated for deployment on Azure Stack. And it's a consistent update across the entire solution. It's not piecemeal. You're not getting updates through Windows Update being done on a different timeline for each component of the system. It's one patch and update solution for the entire integrated system. And that's what's being delivered. And we automate the application and updates across the entire infrastructure designed to minimize disruption of customer workloads. We do have support for some backup and disaster recovery for guest workloads. And so what this allows you to do for VMs that are running on Azure IaaS, an ability to work with Azure Backup and Azure Site Recovery to provide some backup and DR support for the workloads that are running on the platform. And Azure infrastructure can also be managed and stored on an external file store. And then we also have our Azure PaaS services, and we have the ability to replicate and snap blob capabilities as well. We're adding additional reliability and availability backup and restore capabilities across the broader solution post-GA, but even at GA, we have a pretty comprehensive solution, especially for your IaaS workloads running in Stack. Okay, how do you get this thing? The software comes pre-installed on integrated systems that are serviced and billed via EA or CSP with Microsoft. Now, this is a point that we haven't touched on yet. Remember, this is an Azure instance that you're running in your own environment. So it's unlike traditional software that Microsoft has delivered in the past. What that means is it's not following the traditional licensing model of Windows Server or System Center. This is actually a cloud. This is an Azure instance, and because it's an Azure instance, there's no upfront licensing cost for the Azure software that's running on the stack. The entire software solution is on a pay-as-you-use model. What do we mean by that? That means you can get Azure Stack. You only acquire the hardware from our hardware partners, and those hardware partners have a variety of ways that you can license or that you can acquire that hardware, whether you're buying it outright, leasing it, or other options. Each hardware provider has a variety of options for how you can get access to the integrated system. The software is provisioned on those integrated systems, and then the software cost on a pay-as-you-use. You only pay for what you use of Azure Stack. And how does this work? Azure Stack does have a model where it'll actually flow usage meters right into Azure, and you'll get an integrated statement with all your Azure usage that includes usage within Azure Stack. But at Azure Stack, you get a much reduced usage cost than you would have in Azure because it's running in your own environment. So hardware is purchased directly from hardware partners, includes support and installation services. And existing Azure support or Premier support contracts and system support a contract with hardware partners. So this is kind of what I was talking about just briefly, is that Azure Stack extends the Azure packaging and pricing model. It's free. It's a fee for consumption, pay-as-you-use model. No upfront licensing fees. It's compatible with Azure. It uses the same subscription, monetary commit, invoice as Azure. So that means that if you're an EA customer, you can use your Azure EA subscription for flowing meters into the Azure. And we also integrate with the Azure CSP program. So as an Azure reseller, Azure Stack is a part of that reseller motion, so you can have hybrid and solutions that you build in Azure in an Azure Stack, and we will integrate with CSP, and it will flow through the same billing reconciliation model that we have for CSP on how that's resolved. So it literally is an extension of the Azure model. This gives you some insights into the pricing model. There's a price per CPU minimum, price per vCPU min for the Windows Server, and we support both a base fee on the VM plus the cost of a bring your own license if you have a license that you already own, or you want to do a pay-as-you-use license on the image itself. Right now for blobs, tables, and queues, there's a per gigabyte fee, but no transaction fee. And for the app services, that's again a virtual CPU minimum fee. So you get this pay-as-you-use model and meters, and these meters do flow up through the Azure Commerce System. Let's talk about geo-availability. Azure Stack will be available in 46 countries when we launch this summer. So you can see here the breakdown from Americas to EMEA to APAC, all the geographies that will be available in. Hardware and brand availability will vary across these countries, so we encourage you to work directly with your hardware partner of choice, whether it be HPE, Lenovo, Dell, EMC, or even Cisco. Work with those partners to know their availability across these geographies and what they're planning to do. I know that geo coverage will be extended based on customer feedback, and our OEMs are eager to serve additional geographies if there's demand in those geographies. So you have customers or partners in those geographies, I encourage you to have them start contacting their hardware provider of choice. Okay, quick summary of what's new in TP3. And by the way, TP3 has just been made available. We do support ADFS now for disconnected scenarios. That means that you can go off-grid. You can take an Azure Stack deployment and operate in a completely disconnected environment, strictly with ADFS. One of the differences, by the way, between using Azure Active Directory and ADFS is that with ADFS, by definition, it is for single organization. So you have one global GAL for all users accessing Azure Stack. The advantage of using Azure Active Directory is that now you get multiple AAD tenants, much like that scenario I described of an organization using Azure today where they had a dev tenant, a QA tenant, and a test tenant. or an acceptance testing and test tenant that they use for partitioning and segmenting their different use cases. Those kind of scenarios only work with AAD for the multi-tenanted style scenarios, which is also new in TP3. So you have both ADFS and multi-tenancy available to play with. You can start to play with virtual machine scale sets for scale-out workloads. You can now syndicate content from the Azure Stack Marketplace, or from the Azure Marketplace directly into Azure Stack. We now have D-series VM sizes. You can deploy templates with temp disks. That's a new capability that we've made available for more of that Azure continuity and consistency. We have enhanced security and isolation from the kind of operator view as well as the workload view. And remember, Azure Stack inherently is a multi-tenanted platform. So you have this separation between the operator experience in Azure Stack and the self-service experience for developers and users or line of business operators that can come in and get a self-service experience. And we now have a clear security and partitioning and isolation between those two environments in the platform. We have improvements across both the IaaS and PaaS sets of capabilities, and improved infrastructure management functionality and alerting. So there's a lot in our TP3 payload. I do encourage you to go out and take a look at it. The best place to do that, if you go in and you can hit your browser, if you type aka.ms and then you type Azure Stack, just type aka.ms Azure Stack. That'll take you directly to our landing page right there. You can get started with TP3. This will give you the latest build that is made available. If you click that link, that'll take you to basically to get ready for the download. As part of that download, basically we ask you to register, submit it, and you'll be taken to our downloader, which will download the payload. Remember, this is for our POC or dev kit version of Azure Stack. If you want to know what the hardware requirements are to run that, you can take a look at that. We provide a link that allows you to drill in and take a look at the hardware requirements. It is a single server. It's a pretty beefy server, though. The minimum requirements is a 96 gigabyte server with 4 disks, and you can go through the details with precision here, but the recommended configuration is for a 128 gig machine to get started with 16 physical cores. That's the recommended. Truth be told, though, I do all of my testing and validation right now on a 96 gig machine. So I'm actually running minimum today. As a matter of fact, just for giggles, no, I won't. I do have it deploying right now. I'll skip that because it's not connected at the moment. But at any rate, that's what's required to get started with Azure Stack if you want to kick the tires and give it a spin. And when you get the downloader and you start the download, you'll be able to get kind of the latest, the official build that's out there. And we're also providing what we call a dev build, which is a more current build. So we're going to provide pretty recent builds on a regular basis, if not monthly, of Azure Stack, so you can get a view of all the enhancements that are coming on Azure Stack. So that's a great way to get started today. And that just about wraps up our session, and we're right on time. So I don't know if we had many questions coming in.
We do, Bradley, and I'll let me just thank you for that presentation, that information about Azure Stack. I do want to say I know we're close to time, so if you have to drop, thank you for attending, taking time out of your day to join our call. This call will be posted in our Yammer group, as well as the presentation will be posted there as well. If you have more time, feel free to pose a question in the message window, and I'll be sure to get those asked to Bradley within the next couple minutes here. Bradley, we do have one question that's outstanding. Basically, the question is, any development roadmap with target release dates for the upcoming features?
Got it. So our roadmap is for a GA release this summer. That's as much precision as I can provide. So we will have our GA release this summer available where orders can be placed and the integrated systems can come out. Our backlog does include the Azure Container Service and the Service Fabric multi-tenanted services for doing those capabilities. Their release date is post-GA. I would think of those as being more in the early fall timeframe, if not sooner, but it's hard to say precisely when those will land. And then the other things that we talked about post-GA, the priority in our backlog is improving the scale capabilities of the platform. So those are as much as I can share about roadmap and what we're doing from a development standpoint. We're also growing the marketplace syndication. So you'll see that growing pretty aggressively as new and more marketplace items are made available for syndication to Azure Stack, both from Microsoft or third parties and the open source communities.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's actually the only question we had pop up. I know the other comments that were coming in just now are just great job. Looking forward to the GA date. So with that, if there aren't any other questions, again, Bradley, thank you for the presentation, and to all our partners, thank you for taking time out of your day to join the call.
Absolutely, glad to do it.
All right. All right, at this time, I'll go ahead and end the call. Thank you.